Welcome, and thank you for joining us for an evening with Richard Davis and his story of recovery from heroin addiction. Our objective tonight is to show there is hope and a restored life ahead for those who are willing to do what recovery requires. We seek to educate those who do not understand what they're dealing with and perhaps guide them to a right place to find help, possibly a 12-step program dealing with addiction. We want to instill that hope in the loved ones of the active addict as well. I know you will all get something different from tonight's presentation, but it will be what you need at the moment. I'd just like to start by giving some statistics that can be a little bit staggering, really. In a 12-month period ending in April of 2018, there were 70,859 deaths in the United States due to an overdose. That's 1 in every 7.5 minutes. So in the time we'll share tonight, about 9 people will pass from this epidemic. In 2017 alone, Broward County had 1,642 opioid overdoses. 85 of these overdoses were due to heroin. Of these 1,642 cases, 1,237 were released to self-care. Most of these people got no further treatment. The cost of this epidemic is $500 billion a year to the U.S., taxing our already burdened hospitals, criminal justice system, and not to mention the loss of productivity in the business world. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about who you're going to hear tonight. Richard has authored 2 books, We Can Be Heroes and Bullies, Lost Youth, and My Resurgence. He also produced and directed a short film that was released in 2012, title of which is Last Shot, which chronicles his last days of active addiction. I'd like to talk a little bit about Rich the man. He's been clean and sober for over 41 years. This is a feat that few can accomplish. They say bad habits are tough to break and good habits are very difficult to establish. I happen to know this firsthand because my doctor's always telling me that I need to exercise more, and I think the only exercise I get is jumping to conclusions, and he knows this firsthand because I'm also very proud to say that he's my husband. And I can tell you firsthand that he works on himself daily. He writes still, he journals almost every day, he meditates, and his goal every day is try to be a better man than he was the day before. And on most days, he accomplishes that very well. I've seen him work on himself. I've seen him take calls from men and women at 3 in the morning who need his help, and he's always willing to be there for them. He's always grateful for his recovery, has been for a long time, and I think to that he owes the amount of years that he has in recovery, which 41 years is a lifetime. And I am very proud to introduce him today, and I thank him for allowing me to do so. So without further ado, Richard Davis.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Alicia. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment of silence. Tomorrow will be a year since the shooting of Stoneman Douglas, which my wife happens to be a teacher at. So if you can, just let's take a moment of silence for those we lost in that tragedy. God bless them. Before I say anything, I'd like to just read a very, very short paragraph about stories. I happen to be amongst a lot of people from where I was born and raised, and we're constantly trading stories. And I got clean and sober because I identified with stories. Where I come from in my recovery, I'm conditioned to speak 15 or 20 minutes. It's going to be a little bit longer tonight because I'm going to tell some stories. But I want to read something from my favorite book. It's called There's No Business Like Soul Business. And it says, why do we dream in stories? Why do therapists encourage us to tell our stories? Why do we feel the need to tell them in the first place? Why are we so drawn to stories in all their various forms? And why is the entertainment industry one of the biggest and fastest growing industries on the planet? I believe it's because story is the mechanism by which we live, express, understand, and evolve. Story is more than just equipment for living. It's life itself. When a culture's stories are honest, authentic, and connected to the truth, the culture is strong, productive, and progressive. When a culture's stories stagnate and become derivative, deceptive, shallow, and unconnected to the energy of life, the culture erodes, degrades, and eventually perishes, although the people may not realize they're dead. Stories are the manner by which we extract meaning out of the fibrous pulp of our everyday lives. And meaning is the spiritual oxygen that allows our soul to breathe. Without stories, life has no meaning. Without meaning, we cannot live. And what I'm going to share with you tonight is my story. And more than anything, I hope my story can convey a message of a simple one, very well known. If he can do it, I can do it. And my story is probably, compared to what's happening and going on today in our country, my story is not the stereotypical story anymore. You know, we have college graduates, we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have psychiatrists. We have just about anybody walking this planet susceptible and in active addiction. So my story, after you hear it for a while, is probably the story that most people in this country would say, no wonder that kid turned out like he did. Look at where he came from. Well, quite frankly, where you come from today has nothing to do with addiction. I was born into a family. There was 5 before me. My father was a World War II veteran who fought under General George Patton in the Battle of the Bulge. My father was an Irishman from Woodside, Queens, New York. My father was a tough street guy. I didn't know much about my dad. My dad was in jail when I was born. My dad was doing 5 years in Ossining State Prison. And it was told to me from my older brother that the best 3.5 years of my family's life at that time were the 3.5 years that my father was behind bars. He did 3.5 years on his 5-year sentence. So I remember vaguely my father coming back into our home. We lived in a place called Gravesend Projects in Coney Island, New York, the borough of Brooklyn. And I remember vaguely this strange guy coming into the house. I'm not sure if I was more frightened or excited about seeing him. I had no concept of what a father was. I had 5 older siblings, 2 of which nurtured me quite a bit. I was very close to my older sister and my older brother, and I was attached to my mom's apron strings like you wouldn't believe. And my dad coming in didn't take long to live and experience what I learned later on in years was the disease of alcoholism and compulsive gambling. And by the time I was 5 or 6 years old, I was witnessing my dad and his behavior. And I was witnessing domestic violence. And we were already on welfare, my father being in jail. Nobody was going out at that time making a living to support children. And my older brothers and sisters weren't quite old enough at that time to do it themselves. So I was very accustomed to, at a young age, going down to social services with my mom. I was very accustomed to taking notes from my mom and going down to the neighborhood butcher shop and getting some cold cuts and milk and sustenance for the day, pretty much. And probably worse than anything is my mom being depleted by it all. My mom being the subject of domestic violence, witnessing my mom get hit, witnessing my mom, being broke, watching, police come to the house, loan sharks come to the house. Everything went south. I didn't know at the time just how really bad it was. I was a kid. I was 6 or 7 years old, and in addition to my dad's behavior and what was going on in the house, what happens with families like that, they start to gradually disperse. The older ones are making decisions about getting out, 1961, my older brother went to the Navy, and that was my go-to guy. That was my idol. And all of a sudden, this guy leaves, and now I'm left with this monster in the house. With 4 other siblings at the time. In addition to that, there was a little kid running around the streets of his projects on West 33rd Street in Brooklyn having this thing called fun with the rest of the other kids in the neighborhood. And I lived on a very wide street. We lived in the projects across the street, which was a predominantly Jewish area, with small bungalow-like type homes. And I have to tell you, I had a lot of fun growing up in these projects. I loved them. The ethnicity was amazing. We had a little bit of everything. Everybody was poor. Nobody had, any great amounts of money. We didn't have cars. We didn't have telephones. I didn't have any bikes or anything like that, but it was okay. We had hopscotch. We had scuzzy. We had tops. We had yo-yos. We had slinkies. We had just about anything, baseball cards. And I have to tell you, I look back and I find that there were so many other things going on. I remember watching television commercials. And I remember probably before I learned any other song, I knew the Rheingold and Schaefer jingles. And I knew who the Marlboro Man was. I knew what Winston cigarettes were. And if anything can be poisoning, it could be a television, trust me. Because I grew up wanting to be like the Marlboro Man. I couldn't wait for my first quarter Rheingold. Oh, Rheingold was the dry beer. Think of Rheingold whenever you buy beer. Schaefer was the one beer to have when you were having more than one. These things get collected in a young boy's mind, trust me. And add a little dysfunction to that, some alcoholism, some drug addiction, a little bit of mental illness, and self-medicating when you finally hit the streets becomes not only your only option, but the option that you want, pretty much, because it affects it affects your life in so many ways. But again, these things that I was learning, in addition to watching the behavior go on in the home, were not conducive to a good lifestyle. Because of my dad's behavior and my mom not being able to tolerate it, my mom started using prescription medication. My mom started using drugs like Valium, Librium, Seconal, Tuinol, Nebutol, all sorts of drugs. You opened up our medicine cabinet, you had a drugstore there. As prevalent as it is today, it was back then, trust me. And my mom went into a very seriously deep depression. And in 2nd grade, believe it or not, I was left back for truancy because I stayed home with my mom. My mom kept me from school. My mom kept my sister from school. So we had a lot of nasty things going on. Dad disappearing, coming home, wrecking the house, taking a welfare check, leaving my mom without food, lights shut off, no electric, and just really horribly chaotic and dysfunctional. And, it got to the point where they couldn't sustain living in the projects anymore either. So what happens in 1962 or 1963, it just came to a head in Coney Island in the projects, and my dad utilized everything to the point where we couldn't even pay the rent and we were evicted. I remember vividly my mom's furniture being thrown out on the street by the marshal on West 33rd Street. And I was with my sister, one of my older sisters, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And before we could do that, we were shifted to a place called Queens. and we were living now with the cousins, and we all dispersed. We went to a grandmother's house, a cousin's house, an aunt's house. If you know anything about that kind of lifestyle, you know what I'm talking about. And I was put into a cousin's house where I was very uncomfortable. They were a normal family. The father was a fireman. The mom cooked dinner every night. Everything was pretty consistent. And, you could just, I felt the difference between their lifestyle and our lifestyle, and I felt very inadequate. I felt very uncomfortable there. I felt like I had just moved to another planet. And that lasted probably almost a year or so before my mom finally got another place to live in another area of Queens. And we moved around probably in the next 3 or 4 years quite a bit, 3 or 4 different times. I was put into the school system in Queens, and because of being left back in 2nd grade and the year off, they put me in 4th grade. And this is probably where I met one of the first people in my life that had a great influence on my life. Because I was put in 4th grade, and due to my now acting out, my behavior was horrible, playing hooky from school. They threw me out of the New York City Board of Education. They sent me to tutors, in-house tutoring. And when she showed up, I went out the back door and climbed out the window. I wanted nothing to do with education or school. I wanted nothing to do with being social. I couldn't sit. I had too much frenetic energy going on, too much stress and anxiety about what was going on at home with my mom. I was very, very connected to my mom, and I was sickly worried about her at all times as a young boy. I couldn't go out without thinking about my mom possibly not being alive when I got home. And that was a bad obsession for a young boy to have. So what happened in 4th grade, I had this teacher, Mr. Rizzo. I tried to be a good boy. I didn't know that I didn't have control over my behavior. And that's where I started seeing my behavior as being, destructive. And what happened is the Board of Education decided that they were going to send me to family court along with my parents because they couldn't control me. And at age 11 or so, somewhere around 1964, 65, a judge decided that I was supposed to go off and be a good boy in a correctional facility for juvenile delinquents in a place called the South Bronx Spofford Youth House, which at that time was probably the most notorious correctional facility for juveniles in the country. And to make a long story short, I didn't do well, consequently, there. And they shipped me to another place. I didn't do well there either. When I had gotten out of this place, I was probated to what they called back then a 600 school. I found out later on in years that a 600 school was called a 600 school because teachers got paid $600 more than regular teachers. And I found out that information in sort of a miraculous way. But I had been sent to this school, and one of the immediate consequences of it was all black. I was one of 3 white kids in the school, and I had just gotten out of a place where it was predominantly black, all black actually. I was maybe one of 4 or 5 in a population of maybe a couple of thousand. And I had some serious racial issues at that time. So when I was given a bus pass by the Board of Education in New York City to get on this bus and another bus, it was a 2-bus ride. It was quite a racist country at that time. It was 1965. When I got on the bus the first day, I had a bus driver, Caucasian, with a crew-cut haircut, looked like a military soldier. He looked at my bus pass and he said, "You sit in the back, kid." I thought nothing of that. I started to the back, and when I got to the back, I realized that I was amongst probably 10 or 15 other black students going to the same school. It was a school for kids with problems, and they shipped these kids in from South Jamaica and areas out in southeastern Queens. And I have to tell you, for the next 4 months, I got my head beat in. I got humiliated, spit at. cigarettes thrown at me, my family cursed at. And I broke out and broke down and fought. I fought. And I couldn't come past the door. And I tell this story because it's sort of a segue into the grace of God working in my life at a very, very young age, where there's a lot of good stuff happening behind the scenes that in hindsight, that in my recovery, had it not been for my recovery, I couldn't have seen such beauty. So I had to endure a lot of beatings and a lot of humiliation. I used to go to school and disheveled, sweaty, my hair all freaked out, my face red, tears. But I had to go because if I didn't, I was going to go to a place called Lincoln Hall until I was 18. So I was probated there with some serious issues if I didn't go. And my saving grace was that when I got to this school, the first day, I met a teacher. And this teacher, for some reason or another, just decided that he was going to take me under his wing and pay a little bit of attention to me. And for the next 4 months, this teacher was my saving grace. I was every day talking with him and telling him what was going on. And he would tell me to just keep coming back to school. Don't pay attention to those guys. Try to sit as far away as possible. This guy came to my house, talked to my parents, talked about getting me into a vocational school. He knew that I wasn't going to amount to much as far as my parents were concerned and what was going on in my home. He told me to learn a trade, learn something that you're going to be good at. You know, I was a kid. All I wanted to do was get through the day. He'd give me a couple of bucks. He knew I smoked cigarettes at the time. He'd give me cigarettes. The guy was a great, cool guy. He had long hair. He was a Jewish guy. And he looked a little bit like my dad at the time. And this guy, who I knew as Mr. Lewis, became my first mentor in my life. Outside of my brother, who had gone to the Navy, this was the first guy that I attached myself to emotionally and spiritually. And I listened to him. And I kept coming back to school because of him. And believe me, I didn't do anything for anybody by this time in my life. I was on the run. I disconnected myself from any authority. I disliked my parents. I hated my home. I didn't like being there. I wanted a basketball and being in a park smoking cigarettes, and I liked playing cards and gambling at that time already as well. You know, I hadn't yet gotten into any drugs. I drank alcohol a few times, but I wasn't into any substances other than tobacco. But it came a point where after the 4 months or so, I was getting beaten so badly by these black kids on the bus to and from school that I had literally a nervous breakdown one day. And I decided at that time that I wasn't going back to that place. And I didn't go back. I didn't go back. And because of my mom and dad moving so frequently and being evicted from apartments, we just were never able to get contacted by the family court systems for quite some time. And by that time, it was too late anyway. But I took to the streets after leaving that school. And I knew that when I left that school that I was going to miss Mr. Lewis badly. I knew that I was letting go of something that I really felt like it was a life jacket for me. I knew it. I knew it intuitively. I didn't know the severity of my condition at the time. I didn't know how bad it was going to get. I knew my family wasn't reliable. I knew I wasn't going to get anything from them. I knew I was on my own pretty much. And I hit the streets. I hit the streets with a vengeance. And by 12 or 13 years old, I started using substances. I started drinking. I started sniffing glue. I did what a lot of the 60s kids did. You know, glue, alcohol, LSD, amphetamines, barbiturates. I did a lot of drugs up until I was 16 years old. Gateway drugs, I call them. At this time, my dad's condition had gotten really, really bad. My dad had pancreatitis from his drinking. His stomach was shot. His nervous system was shot. My mom was addicted to pills. My mom was badly, badly addicted to prescription medications. And my dad was cashing scripts around different doctors and just doing a lot of crazy stuff for his addiction. And I was witnessing this. And all of a sudden, they couldn't sustain an apartment anymore. We were living in and out of welfare hotels all throughout Queens, the borough of Queens, numerous hotels. My father in 1970 At this time, I was probably into the progression of addiction really, really bad. I hadn't yet found my drug of choice, but I was in bad shape. And I was more shamed than anything else by my lifestyle, my family's lifestyle. My family didn't take care of business. We never went to doctors. We didn't eat well. None of us got an education. I literally left school that 4th grade year and only finished 2nd grade. So that's one of the things that addiction does. That's one of the things that it robs families of. And in 1970, my father overdosed and died, a suicide, in a welfare hotel. And the shame attached to that is horrible. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. All of these things, going back to the Marlboro Man, going back to the Wrangell and the Schaefer commercials, going back to my brother going to the Navy, and going back to the kids on the bus and the Mr. Lewises, and all of this stuff, for a 16-year-old kid at that time, just added up to me just wanting to escape, not wanting to be part of anything. I couldn't hang out with friends without being inferior and feeling like I was invisible. And I have to tell you, I was a good-looking kid. I was a smart kid. I was a street-savvy kid. I was a good athlete. I had a brother who was a star athlete in the borough of Brooklyn. Everybody knew who he was. I have another younger brother who's a great athlete. We were all very athletic, smart guys, liked by the girls, outgoing personalities. None of us are introverts, trust me. We're not wallflowers. We're out there. We had personalities, but they weren't developed properly. They weren't educated properly because of the disease of addiction. My father committed suicide, and at the age of 16, and I only found that out a little while later, that's what's on his death certificate. And when my father died, there was a part of me that was very relieved, and there was a part of me that was horribly saddened. And I didn't know how saddened I was, probably until I was a father myself. And even today, I get very sad that my dad missed out on 8 beautiful children, 30-some-odd grandchildren, 12, 14, 13 great-grandchildren. He missed out on a lot of that stuff. One of the greatest things in my life has been, and greatest gifts of my recovery, has been watching my children grow. And I'm now a grandfather, But at the funeral, I met a guy. He's here tonight, as a matter of fact. My second mentor. I met a guy who told me he'd give me a job for $10 a day doing aluminum siding. I said, $10 a day, 5 days a week, that's $50. A quarter pound of marijuana costs $50. I could buy a quarter pound of marijuana, sell it, make 200, buy a half a pound, then I was an entrepreneur now. I'm going to do with this $50 what I thought I could make more money with. I never bought a quarter pound of marijuana with it. I wound up falling in love with a trade. I worked for him and probably 6 or 7 other guys. I only made $50 a week for the first year or so, but I made more money on going to stores and getting them lunch and coming back and them never asking for change. So I probably made about 60 or 70 bucks extra for that week's work, and I was making friends, and I was learning a business unbeknownst to me. I thought it was just a filler, something temporary. It wasn't going to last. Nothing else lasted in my life. I had consequently the progression of the disease of addiction set in. And I had moved into Astoria, Queens after my dad's death. It seemed to have gotten back to some normalcy again. My mom was getting steady welfare checks. I was working. A couple of the older ones were working out of the house. It was only my mom and my younger brother and sister and I, and it was manageable. We were moving into a place now, a garden apartment. Dad's gone. The bills would be paid, and that all worked out pretty well. I got into the neighborhood and got involved with a couple of the wrong guys. I was a setup for heroin addiction, definitely. And I got involved with the wrong crowd, and by the age 17, and I will never forget, 1971, I did my first $2 bag of heroin from 149th Street and Lexington Avenue in Harlem. And that lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks. I remember vividly, after doing my first bag of heroin, not wanting to hang out in the schoolyard with the guys that I played ball with frequently. I remember now wanting to go the other way. I remember now going to the guys that a couple of my buddies said to watch out for, stay away from. And I gravitated to those guys. And within probably 3 or 4 weeks of my first bag of heroin, which I snorted, I was shooting heroin into my veins. And I was blessed with a rapid progression, very blessed. I went on a tear for the next 6.5 years until age 23. And I've done just about everything that you read about in order to get a shot of heroin. I wasn't even 18 yet, and I had liver disease. I had hep C. At that time, it was called serum hepatitis. I was diagnosed with it. Very, very bad case of it. I still used and I drank on it as well. I had a bad relapse. I almost died from the relapse. By the time I was 18 or 19, I had a string of arrests for crimes I committed to get my shot of heroin. Forget about what I did to myself and what I did to my family, how I stole from my friends. I was a slave to a bag of heroin. It's very hard if you're not involved with an addict to have compassion for an addict. It really is. Knowing what their behavior is, reading the papers about them, and there's such a self-centeredness, such an evil way in which they live and operate and behave. How can anybody have compassion for them? They have a choice. Once active, we don't have a choice. It's a physical and mental spiritual disease. I didn't have a choice anymore. And one of the things that the addict fights, or at least this addict, is the fact that he doesn't have a choice. He thinks he has a choice, but he doesn't. I was thinking about this the other day. I'm a cancer survivor. I was 25 years clean, and I was stricken with cancer. And there's nothing more scary in life other than possibly your child being stricken with cancer than cancer. And I had to go through some horrendous treatments for my cancer. That was 15 years ago. The last time I stuck a needle in my arm was 41.5 years ago. I don't remember one doctor's name who treated me for my cancer. I remember every dope connection I ever had in my life. I remember just about every bartender that served me. That's how powerful this disease is. That's the tattoo it puts in one's brain. I was very sick from this disease, and I didn't know it. Well, 6 years in, I had enough. At age 19, I was arrested under the Rockefeller laws of New York State, and I was facing 6 years to life in prison for it. And for the next 4 years, from 1970, well, next 3.5 years, from 1974, which is when I decided that I would jump bail because I knew I wasn't going to make it in jail. I had happened to, at that time, been a racist. I had an anger problem. I was about 135 pounds. I was suicidal in my behavior, meaning that I would challenge anybody out of my anger and my self-hatred. It didn't matter who it was. I would start a fight with anybody, especially if it was racially motivated. This is my conditioning. This is what the kids on the bus did to me. This is what the kids in the projects did to me. This is what the kids in Spofford and Zariga did to me. So I knew going to jail wasn't an option. I wasn't going to last very long. I was claustrophobic, too. I couldn't do any time in jail, trust me. So I went on the lam, and I ran from 1974 to 1977. And I'm going to bring you to my last acting out. I had made some geographic changes, as most addicts do, to Florida and back, Long Island, and they didn't work. But in 1977, I had hit a bottom numerous times, but there just seems to be another bottom to that bottom. But I woke up on August 16th or August 17th from a blackout that I started going into on July 4th at a party that my cousins were throwing in Forest Park, Queens. And I only remember a couple of things in that 6-week period. And that was 1977. It was the summer of 77, the summer of Sam. It was the summer of the 1977 summer blackout in New York City that I was blacked out in. And I woke up on August 17th, 1977, and the papers on my floor, I had a little room that I was paying $25 a week for. The papers read, "The King is dead, Elvis is dead," and numerous other front pages reading something pertaining to Elvis's death. And I woke up looking at that. And I wasn't a big Elvis fan. I was a British Invasion rock and roll fan, and I wasn't crazy about Elvis, but something internally collapsed when I read that. I knew that he was having a problem with drugs. In addition to that, I had these warrants for my arrest. I was still facing all this time in jail, and I knew that I was going to go back, and I knew my life didn't look that good. My family had pretty much excommunicated me. I couldn't go back to my old neighborhood. I didn't have any friends left there. A lot of them were dying. I really had nowhere to go, literally. It's probably the best thing that happened to me. Probably. I got clean and sober the old-fashioned way. Yeah, I got clean and sober the old-fashioned way. I got sick and didn't sleep for 6 months. Everywhere I went, everything in my body, my bones ached. I was uncomfortable. I twitched. I couldn't stay still. I had twitches, nervous twitches all over me. I couldn't focus. Sleep was horrible. I don't think they do that anymore. I think recovery is coming too easy. I had the gift of desperation when I asked for help. But anyway, I woke up this morning, this August 17th, and in addition to my being sick of myself, I had a landlord banging on the door for 6 weeks' rent that I didn't have. And I had a little Bohack bag. I don't know if you remember Bohack, anybody here, but I had a little Bohack bag. And that's what I had. That's where I had all my life possessions. Everything I owned, I had in a little Bohack bag. It was a little brown bag. It said Bohack on the side of it. Bohack was the Publix or the Winn-Dixie of Queens in the 60s and early 70s. And I remember putting all my stuff in that Bohack bag. I remember having to leave this place. I looked horrible. I was disheveled. My face was broken up. My teeth were decayed. I was putting toilet paper in my decayed teeth to keep my nerves protected. So I wasn't doing well, I promise you. And that's what addiction does. That's what the disease of addiction does. It takes the spirit out of a kid. First, this kid had his spirit taken out, and then it replaces it with a drug. My wife and I have been talking about dopamine lately. The drug is the external dopamine. We don't produce it anymore once we get a shot of heroin in our systems, addicts that are. We don't look for things that stimulate our dopamine in our bodies. When I walked out of that house, I don't know where I was going to go. But I can tell you this much. I went into another blackout, whatever I did, and I woke up on August 28, 1977, which was 12 days or 11 days later. And I made a phone call to a place I made a phone call to a place and I said, my name is Rich and I need some help. Can you please help me? I had been in therapeutic communities, drug programs, and I had tried quite a few things. And when I made that phone call to this place, again, I was facing life in prison. I had 35 cents in my pocket. I had a pair of stovepipe black polyester pants on with a green iridescent shirt with the collar down to my nipples. I was 6'3". I weighed about 135 pounds. I looked like John Travolta strung out on crystal methadone. That's how beat up I was. That's how bad I looked. But I asked for help, and this woman told me, are you someplace safe? Are you okay now? I said, I think I am. It was very early in the morning, and she sent two wonderful gentlemen to help me. And they took me to a diner, and we spoke for about 2 hours or so, and they smoked cigarettes. They let me smoke their cigarettes. They bought me lunch. Breakfast. They treated me like I was gold. And they kept talking about this place. There was meetings and so on and so forth. And I had no idea what they were talking about, but I was listening. For the first time in my life, I was listening with an open mind. I thought that maybe these people can really help me, but I didn't know how exactly. My mind was on getting my next shot, and if I was going to get one, if I even wanted one, and then my mind was on where was I going to go at the end of this day. I had nowhere to go. I was literally homeless. And they took me around 12 o'clock. They dropped me off at this place out in North Shore Hospital, and they said that I was going to go to a meeting. To make a long story short, I went to that meeting, and I met a guy there who wanted to take me to the diner after the meeting. He said, do you want to go to the diner? I says, I ain't got nowhere else to go, pal. I want to go to the diner. And I really thought that the guy had some ulterior motivation helping me. I couldn't conceive of anybody helping me or wanting to help me. I didn't feel worthy of it. But he took me to the diner. He ordered a Reuben sandwich. I remember it vividly because I never knew what a Reuben sandwich was. My diet at the time was Coca-Cola, peanut chews, Marlboro cigarettes, and ice cream. I was not healthy, and I had been eating like that for years. So he took me to this diner, and then he said to me in the diner, he says, hey, listen, I'm going to a barbecue after this. Would you like to come? I said, this guy's looking for something that I don't think I'm going to be able to provide for him. And at the same time, simultaneously, I was thinking about how I could rip this guy off. Take his car, maybe sell his 8-track tape deck, take his wallet. This is the addict thinking. But there had been enough destruction in my life, and somehow or another, enough grace at that time coming through, telling me, this guy is your salvation. This guy has something that you can't even comprehend, but by no means do you say no to this guy or in any way, shape, or form expect anything other than what he's going to give you this next couple of hours that you're with him. And I ran with that. I trusted a voice. I trusted probably the first time my higher self, what was really best for me as a young man. And he took me out to this place, and on the way, he was telling me about this new way of life, this program that he was talking about, and what it could do for me and how it could help me. And he started talking about defects of character and all of this spiritual stuff, and I'm listening to it, and I'm saying, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? This guy's a crack. He's crazy. He's nuts. And he also drove very slowly. We were on the Long Island Expressway. He was a chain smoker. And we're on the Long Island Expressway. He's doing about 35 miles an hour. People are beeping at him, giving him the finger, and of course he's slowing up the expressway. And he's talking to me. And we finally get out to this place. I'm pretty fascinated by the man. And I'm trusting what he's saying, but I'm still worried about what I'm going to do after he drops me off, wherever he drops me off. And he takes me to this place, and he tells me that the guys there, they talk a little bit like me, he said. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they say true, tro, and tree. Well, that's how heavy my Brooklyn accent was at that time. I would spend the next many years trying to talk just like this gentleman because he was very educated, and I loved how he pronounced words, and I loved his dialogue. I loved how he talked. I fell in love with everything about the guy. But he took me to this house, and we got out of his 71 Ford LTD, and we began to walk up the driveway of this home that we were going to. And I was petrified. I was terribly frightened. I looked horrible. I felt horrible. I felt dead inside. And I was very shamed and humiliated by what I had done to my life and how I looked. And when we walked up the driveway, I saw this woman come out, and I heard this voice, "Richie Davis, we've been holding a seat for you for a long time." And I look up, and it's a wonderful woman, Linda, that knows me since I'm a kid. And it's my beautiful friend who's here tonight, Billy, who taught me the industry that I've been in all my life. And it was their house. Not only was it a miracle that it's their house, but I had lived with them before. They had clean clothes of mine. They had jeans of mine, underwear, socks of mine. And I came into that house, and I entered the kingdom, trust me, of recovery. And I met men there that just became my life. And that's what I say, I did it the old-fashioned way. I listened to men. I listened to men who were here before me. I took suggestions, and they were relentless. They didn't let up on me. They wouldn't let up on me. This wonderful man who brought me out there put me in a room. I slept in a car for the first week. I wouldn't tell him I was homeless. But he put me in a room. I couldn't work for the first few months because I couldn't sleep. I couldn't function. I drank coffee, smoked cigarettes. I went to these wonderful things called meetings. And I got active. And I started thinking like a civilized human being. I couldn't read a lick. I had a hard time comprehending, what I was reading. I couldn't retain anything. And this wonderful man said, "You just read a sentence at a time." And then I read a sentence, and then I read a paragraph, then I read a page, and then I read more pages. And I started to keep a journal. I started to write. I started to do all these little things that made me all of a sudden feel like a human being. I thought I was stupid all my life. Well, most of my life, I thought I was stupid. I didn't get any education. How could I not be stupid? And thinking that was stupid. So this wonderful thing that I'm introduced to turns me into a civilized human being, and I stay clean and sober. I come into the 80s. I have a new life. I'm back to work. I've found an incredible amount of friends. I've done some traveling. I took some acting classes, some dancing classes. Went to Manhattan, got into the arts, went to Broadway shows, loved the ballet. I started doing all of this stuff that I was envious of people doing. I've witnessed a lot of death from this disease of addiction. And in the 80s, I got probably hit with the worst amount of deaths I could ever have imagined. I watched a lot of my comrades, a lot of my brothers in recovery, stricken with the virus, HIV. I watched wonderful men and women and children go down. They went down, for the most part, with integrity, with dignity. They went down clutching recovery, clutching a spiritual life, holding on to, the beauty of their recovery and what they got, in their second chance at life. And I watched countless men go through the 80s and 90s and suffer from that disease. One of the things that I never lost track of was this guy, Mr. Lewis. I would always think of Mr. Lewis. I tried to look him up. Back then, all you had was 411. You had the yellow pages and the white pages, and maybe an operator And I couldn't find Mr. Lewis for the life of me. I didn't know his first name. I never called him by his first name. But I never lost track of this guy, and I tried many, many times for many years to find him, because I wanted to thank him, because he instilled in me for the first time in my life, some hope. Some hope. And I didn't have much of that as a kid. When I met him, I was smoking cigarettes, spitting a lot, cursing, because I thought that was cool. I thought that allowed me to fit in, I was horribly OCD at that time, too. I remember counting odd and even numbers and bringing them to conclusions that seemed to satisfy my thinking. I remember looking at license plates and remembering them. And I remember keeping track of a lot of things that most normal kids don't keep track of. Why? Because my mind needed to be stimulated and distracted at the same time. Imagine needing to be stimulated and distracted at the same time mentally. That's a really sick place to be. But anyway, I wanted to find this guy, Mr. Lewis. And I couldn't find him for the life of me, and I gave up, And teachers happen to be my favorite people. I'm married to them, the best. And Mr. Lewis just put a tattoo on me that wouldn't let me sleep. And somewhere around 20 some odd years of my recovery, I was living out in Long Beach, and I had done a lot of work for many teachers in the area. And I got a call from one of those teachers one night and said, Rich, I have a friend who had a problem with a contractor, and he walked off the job. Can you go see her? And I went and I saw this woman, and we talked, and I sold her the job. And when I came to do the job, I had my crew and I had my truck the first day there, and I just so happened to look at the house next door, and the gutter was falling off. And I find that, that's my thing. I work on homes, and I notice things like that. Interior decorators, they walk into your house, and they examine your furniture and your decor and so on. So I see this gutter hanging off, and I, for some reason, say, I'm going to fix it, and I won't even tell the guy, Well, it just so happens that afternoon, this old man comes walking by, and he's very fragile, frail. He asked who the boss was, and I said, that's me. I said, can I help you? He says, you think you can fix my gutter for me? He says. I said, I saw that a little while ago, buddy. I was thinking about fixing it for you anyway. I said, yeah, I'll take care of it, probably tomorrow. Don't worry about it. He says, fine. Next day comes, I'm sitting out there again with the guys, and I fixed the guy's gutter. And he comes by and he says, did you fix it? I said, yeah, I fixed it. It's fine. He says, thank you so much. What do I owe you? I said, don't worry about it. And I give him my business card. And I said, if you need anything in the future, you give me a call, So the guy takes my card and he walks away. I go back up on the garage roof. And about 3 or 4 minutes later, I hear this scream. I hear the door open. I hear the scream. And the guy comes yelling out to me. He says, Richard Davis, are you Richard Davis? I says, yeah. He said, did you go to such and such school? And my pat answer at that time was, I didn't go to school, pal, He says, did you go to Walter Reed? And I look at him, and I said, did I go to Walter Reed? I said, that's Mr. Lewis. That's Mr. Lewis. And lo and behold, Mr. Lewis was living 2 miles away from me all the time. That was Mr. Lewis. And the wonderful thing about this is his wife came out. They were jumping up and down on the lawn. We were all jumping, and we were just praising the moment. It was just something out of Disney World. It was unbelievable. And I couldn't get enough of him right there. We decided we would meet for dinner that night. And we had a wonderful next 3 or so months. And he met my children. One of my sons reminded him of me more than the other. And he started bringing back memories of me and talking. It was just an incredible, incredible experience, And unfortunately, he was suffering from colon cancer. It had gone into remission, and it came back. And I thought that I was coming back into his life because of me. God was giving me this wonderful gift, you know, and again, and you know, we had a good sit down. George, his name is, him and I. He lasted 4 months, the exactly amount of time that he spent with me in school. He lasted 4 months. He died in Mount Sinai Hospital, but just before he died, a couple of things happened. Number one, he told me that he prayed to have me back into his life. His wife told me he has spent most of his life with her, wondering if I was alive, if I had made it, and prayed for me all the time. And then he said to me, one day we were together, I took him to lunch, and he said, Rich, he said, what have you always wanted to do? And now here's a kid who thought he was stupid, you know. I said, I don't know, George. I said, you know, I tell a lot of people, you know, my story, and I speak a lot, and they told me I should write a book. He says, you're going to write a book. I said, George, I don't even know where to put a period, a colon, comma, or anything. I says, I'm not writing no book. He says, you're going to write a book. I said, I don't think so. You're crazy. He said, but you're gonna. Anyway, well, George passed. And I was part of his eulogy, a temple in Long Beach, and it was just an amazing experience. It's sort of like the universe, like working behind me all my life. As I look back in hindsight, I see how grace has been a part of my life, and for the most part, me not even knowing it. And George was that grace as a boy when I needed it most, because I really think I was thinking at that age of suicide. And he erased that thought from me. But my kids know about George today, and he's an incredible human being. So I go on, and I'm going to pretty much wind this down. I could talk all night, and I don't want to keep you guys here all that much longer. I'm conditioned to speak 15 or 20 minutes usually, but I wanted tonight to tell my whole story. I have a lot of friends that know me, but don't know me, really. And who doesn't like telling stories? And I've never told a story where the person I'm telling it to didn't want to tell me a better one, you know? And it's important for me to hear my story and know my story as well. And after George passed, I decided one day I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write a book. Now, I didn't have a computer. I wrote the first almost 40,000 words by hand. And let me tell you, nothing was legible. You couldn't read anything. I said, I got to get this thing called a computer. And I got the computer. And I didn't know anything about periods, commas. I knew nothing about punctuation. I knew nothing. I was an English teacher's nightmare, probably, you know. But I got software, and I learned how to write on the computer. And I learned that I can have somebody do that for me. And I learned why editors are editors. And I stopped, I should say, letting things like that intimidate me and keep me from doing something creative. And I did that, and I took off, and for the next 6 or 7 years, I worked on a book that I had a professional edit for me, and did a lot of other writing. It was an incredible experience for me. And I still write today, and I write, I get different times in my life where I write different things, and but I stay in a creative mode. The film that I did, I got a thought about it in 2009, and I said, write a script, Rich, write something. I said, I never wrote a script. You can't write a script. Well, 2012, I opened that, I premiered that in New York. I went online. I had people, I needed nearly $30,000, and people, you know, supported me and supported the film. And I got it into some film festivals. And, you know, this isn't like, look how great Rich is. This is all recovery. This is all God's grace. This is all through people. This is all through the Billy Sullivans, the George Lewis's, and some other wonderful people, you know. If I had one thing to wish for today, other than always, of course, my children's health, I wish I would have my dad. If I could, I would give a limb to spend an hour with him. I'd probably give 10 years of my life to somebody else to get an hour with that guy. There's a lot of people dying from this disease, as Alicia alluded to tonight in opening. The day before Thanksgiving, my son called me hysterical. His son had died of his best friend had died from a heroin overdose. I get those calls a lot, man. There's not a week that goes by that I don't hear of somebody close to me dying from a heroin overdose. My children calling me, this one's dead, Dad, that one's dead, Dad. This one, it's horrible. The ratio of success, people coming in asking for help and getting it is horrible. It's devastating to think of it. So, I don't have a magic wand. I don't have a cure. I have just me. If I can express to anybody anything about recovery, it's that if I can do it, you definitely can. And I did do it the old-fashioned way. I took the lumps. I took the consequences that I put myself through. My first few years, I was beat up. My body was beat up. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't get comfortable anywhere. But I didn't act out and go for the drug anymore. I couldn't do it. I went to the men in my life. I went to the people who had strength. I went to the people who would support me and lift me up, not advocate or not buy into my stuff and let me go back to the neighborhood. I did things that were conducive to good mental health. I did things that set me up for a nice future and a relatively good life, So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for my gift. I have 3 wonderful children. I have great, great, great friends. And I know I forgot a lot, but I probably took you too long anyway into the night. But I'm willing to help anyone to get this gift that I've been so freely given. And I thank you all for coming tonight and listening to me. Thank you.